Let this record. Okay.
Hello, I'm Joe Sirgy. I'm interviewing Michael B. Frisch. He's a professor of psychology and neuroscience at Baylor University. And he's the author of Quality of Life Therapy. It is a book that received quite a bit of attention in the positive psychology movement. And he is a prominent researcher in the field of quality of life studies. Mike, may I ask you a few questions?
Yes, Joe.
Okay, well, we start out with something about where did you grow up?
I grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Aha. What was it like? Tell us something about your interests and hobbies.
Well, I was very lucky to, it's a very ethnic Catholic town, and I got a tremendous amount from private Catholic education, actually. So I had parochial education and found that I was good in school, and I went to this Jesuit high school. It was kind of like a taste of college, called Marquette University High School down the street from the university, and it really gave me a head start. And many of the Jesuits had to have 2 or 3 advanced degrees before they were ordained. So many of them had degrees in psychology, and which piqued my interest.
Great. Tell us something about your parents.
Well, my parents valued education a lot. My mother was particularly gifted verbally and would read 5 or 6 newspapers, something I continue to inflict on my own students, where they read the New York Times every day and try to apply what they're learning to the real world, because they're going to be running the world soon in the spirit of civic engagement and integration. My mother was a school teacher. My father was a real estate salesman.
I see. Well, being a professor of psychology and neuroscience, of course, you're very much interested in psychology. Tell us something about what sparked your interest in psychology.
Well, as I was saying, these Jesuits, I was always fascinated with people. I've always loved people. This is very much like my father, where he, he wasn't that interested in selling real estate. He liked to hang out and visit with people. So I've always had that extroversion interest. I've always loved people, been fascinated by them, and then I was exposed to these Jesuits who had psychology degrees and taught courses in it. So I decided to major in psychology at the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, and there was a plethora of undergraduates, but not graduate students. So I finagled it somehow. Some wonderful professors chose me to be a teaching assistant, and I functioned like a graduate student. So I took advanced courses, I taught research method lab and other things, and this further piqued my interest and got me ready and psyched for clinical psychology graduate school.
Well, that's great. So essentially, you're saying that the Jesuits were the ones who inspired you to get more involved in psychology. Is that what you're saying?
Very much so, yes.
Great. Tell us something about your home life.
Growing up?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I was I always had a lot of wonderful friends, and was given a lot of freedom, maybe too much freedom to do what I'd like, but I always did well in school, so my parents cut me slack, and then I played sports, and played basketball on a Marquette University high school team that won the state championship 2 years in a row. But I had a real passion for music, so I taught myself guitar, I taught myself drums, particularly after the death of my brother. I had a brother who was 1 year older than I was. At 18 years old, he was in a trip en route to a South Dakota Indian mission with these Jesuits, a reservation. And the priest, one of my favorite teachers, fell asleep at the wheel. My brother was killed, several other people, and a priest. And I think this inspired me somewhat to get involved in service. So I also got involved in the American Red Cross. But I did it my own way. So I had the only program in the country where we tried to register voters when the law changed and 18-year-olds had to vote. So my brother inspired me to do volunteer work, and then in 1974, I think it was, I was chosen as the sole United States representative to a conference in England, Guildford, Surrey, that had people from all over the world, from 50 different countries, and we shared our ideas about service. But it was a great experience because I had to plan service projects with young people from all over the city. And then the wonderful silver lining in it was I worked at the Red Cross near downtown Milwaukee, and what that entailed was I'd sign people in for first aid classes, and this might be at 5 or 6 o'clock, and they wouldn't get out till 10 or 11, so I got to study all that time. And it was very helpful for me in my college years, because I went to University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, in part because I think my parents wanted me around, and my girlfriend, and all my friends went to, out east to Ivy League schools. Plus, we didn't have any money really to speak of. So, but the Red Cross was very good for me because I got got paid for studying.
That's great. Well, let's focus on quality of life studies. What sparked your interest in that topic?
Well, I had some, you wouldn't think of it maybe, but University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee had some wonderful, accomplished scholars. One was Tom Stamfel, who is a real pioneer in the area of exposure therapies and plosive therapy. And Tom was a Renaissance man. He knew a lot about learning theory, but he also learned a lot about he knew a lot about philosophy of science and art. And he actually applied, learning theory ideas to exposure and developed one of the early exposure treatments that now rule the world in terms of helping people with anxiety disorders. And one of the things that Tom taught me and other behavioral psychologists and behavior therapists and cognitive behavior therapists was that the sine qua non of an academic is to find an area that maybe others have not looked at and try to see if it's applicable to the clinical enterprise. So in my first academic job, and where I started when I was 26, and I've stayed at Baylor ever since, I would read the journals, and I was inspired by an American Psychologist article by John Flanagan. And he was a researcher that developed something called Project Talent, and he looked at the quality of life of American high school students and broke it down into these categories, and I was just mesmerized by this. I thought it was so interesting. This is 1978, and by the time, and then of course Ed Diener's work, his seminal Psych Bull article, 1984. And I started then to really think about developing an instrument of quality of life. And my idea, again, was to apply this area from social psychology, personality, to the clinical enterprise. And my idea was very simple, which is most clinical measures focus on negative affect and symptoms of disorder. And so we're missing the whole area of positive affect, quality of life, and happiness. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to supplement these pathology measures with something that was more positive and real-world oriented? So it had a lot of practical domains or areas of life, like love and work, that you could address clinically. In addition, I thought it would be exciting to use this with people that didn't have DSM disorders. It's now called personal coaching or professional coaching or executive coaching. So I also thought about non-clinical applications for people who just wanted to be happier. And I received tremendous support and encouragement from you, Joe Sirgy, my dear friend and inspiration, Ed Diener, who invited me to some ISQUALS meetings, Alan Kasdan, probably one of our most meticulous, some would say anal retentive researchers. He's a Yale professor who is known for having meetings with students where they stand up for 10 or 15 minutes. They don't even sit down to talk because you're so busy. I'm not sure if that's apocryphal or not, but Alan Kasdan, I did a huge multi-site study of my quality of life inventory, and Alan Kasdan reviewed it and was very excited and commissioned me, so to speak, to do a more general review of the quality of life, well-being, happiness literature for clinical psychology. This was a review I submitted. I mean, it was easily 100 pages, and Alan, he reviewed it and accepted it within an hour. It was amazing, you know. But he really thought this was important, and he started to use quality of life measurements himself. And so, and as I got into the measurement, I started to think about, well, what are some interventions for these domains of life? Because I conceptualize well-being as composed of kind of like Ed Diener, you know, life satisfaction, high positive affect, low negative affect. And I thought that this overall concept of happiness, after you take out temperament and happiness set range or set point, and something I call scars of abuse, which I think can also affect how grumpy or miserable you are as a person, that your happiness is made up predominantly of your fulfillment in these 16 areas of life. I call the Sweet 16. And this is something I came to by looking at your work and other social indicators research and hundreds of studies and books from the social indicators movement, studies of countries and individuals. And I tried to boil it down to these 16 areas, because another one of my mentors, John Rush, who together with Aaron Tim Beck wrote the Cognitive Therapy of Depression book. He had just moved to Dallas, and I called him for some training. He invited me up there, and John said if I have an assessment, it has to be administrable in like 5 minutes because doctors are so busy and physicians. So I narrowed it down to these 16 areas, and as I got into it, I thought about, well, what are some interventions to improve fulfillment in these areas? Because if you see happiness as you know, a function of these 16 areas, then
well, Mike,
yeah.
Tell us something about those 16 areas.
Okay.
16 areas of life.
Yes, well, let me show you. Can you get this in the camera?
Yeah, it looks like.
Do you have is this a good angle? Go ahead and adjust it.
It is a good angle, yes.
Okay, so the top bar is your overall quality of life.
Right.
The bottom profile, this is what go ahead and adjust it. This is what positive mental health looks like. So we were great, you know, we're great with negative mental health and clinical problems, but this is like an MMPI of positivity.
Right.
And here we have this overall score, and a client, either a coaching client, someone in business or working for a nonprofit, lawyers, doctors, physicians I've worked with, police personnel, sex offenders. I mean, I've done this with everybody. They may score low at the top, and that then means that they're at risk for problems of what I call the trinity of happiness benefits, which are problems in health, work, and relationships. And the first thing they're going to say is, well, what do I do to fix this, Dr. Frisch? And so what I'll say is, well, let's look at this profile. The areas on the bright side, so to speak, are areas of strength and fulfillment. Your most cherished needs, goals, and wishes are being fulfilled in these areas. But the dark side areas are specific areas where there's a lack of fulfillment. Your most cherished needs, goals, and wishes are not being fulfilled. And we need to move the dark side areas to the light side, so to speak, using a Star Wars analogy. You know, move to the bright side, or Luke Skywalker is the idea.
Right. So this is an instrument that would allow you as a therapist to identify areas in which the person is dissatisfied in certain areas of life. And then you have another type of instrument that allows you to assess the importance of these areas.
Well, that's a really good question, but we need to back up for a minute. First of all, this is an overall well-being measure, and technically it's life satisfaction. So we get an overall picture, and then it breaks it down into these 16 areas. The 16 areas make up the overall score. So, and this is where clients like this, whether they're clinical or business clients, they like it because they can see, okay, yes, I'm really miserable in my work. There's a lack of balance in my life, which a pioneering researcher, Joe Sirgy, talks about, a lack of balance in my work and personal life, you know. So then we prescribe evidence-based interventions for the areas of life that are where there's a lack of fulfillment, but they're important.
Right.
But you're bringing up another point, which is this is one of the only well-being tests that weigh satisfaction by importance. And this is a fancy way of saying that too often researchers have used a cookie-cutter approach to happiness, where they assume that you value everything the same as your grandmother or your mother or someone else or someone from a different ethnicity. And in my model, if an area is not important to you of these 16, we knock it out of the test.
Exactly. So, okay, let's focus on, once you identify those areas that are important and people are dissatisfied in
Yes.
those areas of life, tell us something about the interventions that you apply to help that particular person to become more satisfied with their life.
Yes, and I might say that even people who are fairly happy may want to be happier, so they can ask for more.
Good.
Well, I think the first important thing is to try and build motivation for any intervention. And I do that by bringing up what I call, from my Catholic background, the trinity of happiness benefits. So a client will say, why do I have to waste my time with this, you know, and why should I do this positive psychology or well-being program? And I'll say, well, happier people enjoy 3 important benefits. One is they're healthier. They actually live longer. A wonderful study of Catholic nuns from my hometown of Milwaukee, bring it back to my background, show that more cheerful nuns and the sisters of St. Francis live 9 years longer than less happier ones. And so that's health. Another area is happiness. Greater happiness improves relationships, which I call the holy grail of happiness, because in the happiest people all have rewarding relationships. It's not always enough, but it seems to be necessary, maybe not sufficient for a very happy or chronically happy person, to use the terminology of Sonia Lyubomirsky. So, what was your question again?
The intervention.
Okay, so I'm saying if you do this program, you'll be healthier, you'll have better relationships, and then you'll be more successful in work. Which is your area, you know, so management psychology. So we know that happier people make more money, their customers like them, they have the stock prices of their companies are higher. Tremendous benefits accrue to people who are happier. In fact, the Asian Institute of Positive Psychology in Beijing asked me to come speak because they want to make their workers happier, and essentially so they can get more productivity out of them, but also greater job satisfaction, which is a lesson that you, of course, have espoused in your work.
So the impetus behind the intervention that you're talking about in terms of quality of life therapy would be, again, 3.
Well, no, this is motivation. And then after that, we look at areas of low fulfillment that are they're important to you, but you're dissatisfied, and we target those for evidence-based interventions.
Okay, tell us a little bit more about that.
Okay, well, first of all, you shouldn't, and this may be part of the rationale, but you shouldn't spend time with well-being or positive psychology interventions or assessments that aren't research-based or evidence-based or empirically validated. Unfortunately, the field is full of this, and I think it's a potential problem that Martin Seligman has talked about. And my approach, just to mention this, the test I use and the intervention approach is evidence-based by the technical definition, which is you have numerous randomized controlled trials in more than one laboratory and in laboratories other than just the authors.
So you're talking about those interventions that you suggest to a client possibly are evidence-based.
Correct. There's a treatment manual called a book I have called Quality of Life Therapy, and then these just to mention these trials. Jim Rodriguez of Harvard Medical Center and Beth Israel Medical Center in Boston has already done. He has several in the works, but he's already done 2 published trials finding my approach superior to the usual treatment for people in great distress, people awaiting lung transplants or kidney transplants. He even found that the effects were contagious to a caregiving spouse who never received the treatment or training. Isn't that interesting? So the patients, they might wait 1 to 3 years for a lung transplant. They're in great distress. Their caregiving spouses have increases in well-being, increases in positive affect, greater social intimacy. This is so exciting because caregivers are and their spouses can be in very turbulent relationships, but their social intimacy increased, and all these benefits accrued to the spouses who weren't even in the treatment. Finally, this has been tested in other laboratories, including a laboratory in, you want a different laboratory far away, how about Iran? So we go from Boston to Iran, and the approach has been Abedi and Vastansis have validated it with parents of children with obsessive compulsive disorder who are also very beleaguered and stressed out. Okay. Anyway, so it is an evidence-based approach. It's also being tested with different professional populations. And we just had a grant approved in the last week for applying this approach to people who use portable defibrillators for heart disease, because we know that increases in positive affect reduce cardiac arrhythmias. So we're hoping to reduce cardiac events outside of any benefits of medication with my quality of life therapy.
Okay. So there's plenty of evidence suggesting that
well, it's important. Yeah, it's important.
Intervention has quite a bit of benefit in psychological terms, emotional terms. Tell us a little bit more about the intervention itself.
Okay. Well, we have evidence-based strategies for every one of the Sweet 16 areas of life. So it can be as simple as turning to that page in the treatment or intervention manual. So if someone's unhappy with work, you can just turn to that chapter and there's evidence-based interventions. We also have an all-purpose intervention, an approach to problem-solving in general, called the 5 Paths to Happiness, or the Casio model. And this is very powerful. So let's say there's problems at work. Well, Casio, this actually, and the beautiful thing about this to me is it honors our progenitors. It honors our mentors in the field. So this actually comes directly from Angus Campbell's work and people like this.
What does Casio stand for?
Yes, okay, so to improve happiness in work, for example, you can change the C in Casio, which is circumstances. So coming from Texas, there's a Johnny Paycheck country song that says, "Take this job and shove it." You know, you might have to change work or change the type of work. Maybe a lot of my clients have been kicked up into supervisory positions and they miss the work itself, whether it's remodeling homes or retrofitting airplanes for Saudi Arabian princes. The A is attitude. And these are cognitive restructuring interventions aimed at looking at whether you really understand what's going on in an area correctly and you're interpreting it correctly. So for example, your boss may be ignoring you and you interpret this as a poor evaluation of you when in fact his wife has just been stricken with heart disease. So
change the circumstance.
Change the attitude. And the I's importance. These are priorities. So in your work, you're saying how we need to pay attention to all the areas of life we care about. So if there's a lack of balance, we may decide for a workaholic person, he may actually be working, succeeding in spite of his workaholism. So we might say, well, let's put a little less emphasis on work and more on your family life and hobbies. And that will bring I believe in play is a recreate the person's spirit so that they have more to give work in other areas of life. That's the I. The S is standards of fulfillment. And the father of psychology, William James, was a wonderful teacher, but plagued with depression. He had very high standards for himself, and he kept trying to be a round peg in a square hole. He kept trying to succeed in medicine, which he hated, when his love was philosophy and psychology. So, but he himself said one way to improve happiness is to lower your expectations. On the other hand, I work with people on probation, the criminal justice system, whose expectations are too low. In fact, the best goals are high, challenging, and specific, as you know from the area of business that you're in. So the O is other areas of life. So let's say you're having problems in your love life and work life, and it's going to take a long time to improve these. You may accrue some benefits in happiness by focusing on areas you never thought of before. So one of my clients, I call her Texas because she actually hated Texas. She paraphrased the line from a chorus line to play and said, "Suicide in Texas is redundant." Suicide in Texas is redundant. She was from Vermont. And so one of the things for her is we had a lot of problems to work on. She was hit by a car in a school drop-off zone. Her marriage was troubled. So, and she was already getting exercise. She had a dog. She walked and did Pilates at home. But we got her involved with a local YMCA where she met other people from the East Coast who were happy in Austin, Texas. And we call this idea of expert friends. You find someone that are in your boat in life that are functioning well and try to learn from them. So she made these, and then she made these friends from the East Coast, but then she also made these friends from Texas. And this challenged her stereotype that everyone in Texas is a stupid conservative bubba that only cares about themselves.
That sounds to me like compensation. Does this concept have an affinity to what some of the quality researchers talk about in terms of how you look at other domains and in essence and you invest in those other domains in a way to compensate for dissatisfaction in this one particular domain?
Very much so. Very much so. But I would also say this is a life goal approach. It's very unique among a lot of positive psychology approaches. And we don't shy away from difficult goals. So another one of my clients, I call her Cinderella because she was basically acted like a scullery maid for her husband and daughter. And she had a plane crash in the San Francisco Bay. There's a law against airplanes having only one engine flying over a body of water, because if that engine fails, you can crash. Well, she crashed or technically ditched. Her husband didn't come to visit her right away. She asked him if he was happy that she lived, and he didn't answer her question. So she eventually had to, so there was compensation strategies, but she also had to develop well, you know what, this is a compensation approach. Her husband wouldn't come to counseling, and so she developed a career as a clergy person, as a rabbi.
There you go.
But she also eventually left the marriage, and at age 71 went looking for another soulmate in her life. And we don't shy away from this. So, you know, she had heard from her friends that all the men were dead or taken, the good men. But we found somebody. And in her case, it was what I call the cultural center of Waco, Texas, which is our Barnes & Noble bookstore. And she found a man there and fell in love. And so we compensate, but we also do not forsake goals that are near and dear to someone's heart.
Great, Mike. So the Casio model, again, is sort of a general model that can apply to literally
Any of the Sweet 16, yes.
Any of the Sweet 16, exactly. Okay, let's focus on one of those areas. Let's say money, I think.
Okay.
You know, focusing on money is something that is universal.
Yes, yes.
And tell us something about those strategies. Let's say if we have a person who's constantly running out of money and very unhappy because has money problem, financial stress, and that kind of thing. What kind of interventions do you suggest for a person who has money problems?
Well, one of the things I want to emphasize is that even if, let's say, I don't have time to treat the person or they're referred to someone else, it's important to note that the quality of life inventory, which is part of my approach, also called the QOLI, is also evidence-based. It predicts productivity at work. It predicts academic retention in college 1 to 3 years in advance. So some psychologists will just give the test and maybe leave the client on their own to come up with interventions. This is a non-pathology oriented test, so clients are actually clients may purchase this themselves from Pearson assessments and to take their own emotional temperature, so to speak. But let's say I had a client with money problems. There are many, first of all, the test is written on a 6th grade reading level. That's the level of most of our newspapers in the United States, which is kind of depressing, but I want people to be able to read it. So money is really, the definitions are very rich and detailed in my approach. And money is really, it's composed of many elements, wealth in general, really. It refers to the money you earn or benefits, government benefits or whatever. And it also refers to the possessions that you have, savings. And then it also refers to your expectations for having enough in the future, which is a huge issue today in Western societies where people aren't saving for retirement, and it's a very frightening thing. So someone may have a bit of money but be concerned about the future. Now, the way we approach money is, we'll first of all look at the person's career. And this kind of overlaps with work, but we want to see if it's a career that has high flow activity, but also is enough to pay the bills. So we might have to go into some career counseling or work counseling. We're very holistic about this.
I see.
And then we'll also look at, so we'll look at their job. We'll also look at the possibility of some kind of a budget, you know, using contemporary software, you know, like Quicken or something. There's free financial counseling available from the Consumer Credit Union, people like that.
How about if we focus on love life?
Okay, love is very good. Well, there's issues with love in terms of, first of all, finding a relationship to begin with. So my model of all relationships, whether platonic friendships or love life, is that you want someone that's going to be a very good friend, even your best friend. So there's strategies for finding someone that you, for finding a mate, but there's also strategies for enhancing a relationship with a mate that you already have. What we do here is we look at, first of all, we want to know each other. We want the couple to know each other's deepest hopes, dreams, and aspirations. So we'll do a QOLI exchange technique where they both take the quality of life inventory and exchange it. And this can be very powerful because sometimes couples don't communicate very well. And this case of Texas I talked about, she really was unhappy with her husband because he had promised to get her out of Texas after a couple of years and didn't honor that commitment. Then we also look at relationship skills that are empirically validated, things like couples trying to do little things for each other every day, techniques for problem solving, which we limit. So you only talk about problems maybe once a week, or if they come up, in addition to that, you put a kitchen timer on, and we try to limit the discussion of problem solving so that it doesn't dominate the relationship. we want that golden ratio of 5-to-1 that John Gottman talked about, or up to 10-to-1, which is the Lasada line of Barb Fredrickson, if you look closer at that. We'll also ask couples to think about what attracted each other initially, what attracts them now to their partner, and try to build up a positive reward system to improve their relationships. So, and finally, we have 4 tenets of contentment. These are nuggets of wisdom from positive psychology that you can use. So one tenet of contentment for relationships is emotional honesty. This is built on the old idea of assertiveness training, where you become in touch with your most cherished needs, goals, and wishes. Maybe even write a letter or compose an email to your partner that you never send to get in touch with your feelings. And then you may decide to share it with them, but we'll use our relationship skills so we don't permanently damage the relationship, and then share that with the person. That's emotional honesty. Favor bank is from the Tom Wolfe novel called Bonfire of the Vanities, where these Irish cops and lawyers and police officers would all do little favors for each other, so that when someone needed something or was in trouble, they very generously gave to each other. And we try to create a culture of gratitude in a couple's relationship so that their emotional bank account is always full and they're happy to help the other person. Another idea is expert friend, which we already talked about. And finally, string of pearls. This is a very kind of a poetic approach to looking at your day as a series of relationships. And I developed this before Barb Fredrickson wrote her new book, Love 2.0, but she's actually promoting this as a sine qua non of happiness. But string of pearls means that you look at each interaction of your day as significant, and you try to connect with that person on a meaningful level. And in that sense, you're making it's like you're making a pearl necklace of positive interactions for the day. With boys or adolescents, I call it a shark teeth choker or something. But anyway, so you're trying to connect with that person in a positive way. So for me, I know the family life in detail of the people that give me coffee in the morning in the Baylor Science Building. You know, I know Dolores just got robbed and got a dog to prevent that, or and I try to connect with them. I bring them flowers or cookies or things like that. That's a thumbnail sketch of relationship interventions.
Mike, your book has been very well received. I know for a fact that it influenced my own thinking, and I just wanted to read to the audience a snippet of from one of our gurus in well-being and subjective well-being research, who's Ed Diener. A lot of people know him, and he said something about the book, which is called Quality of Life Therapy, is an approach to well-being and positive psychology. It is a state-of-the-art, evidence-based, and it's well-validated, an outstanding guide for anyone interested in learning about the practice of positive psychology and well-being. So here's an endorsement of essentially the most famous guru.
Well, you're so kind. And I was very touched that Ed and his wife, Carol, who's a psychologist and lawyer, they read my book, and Ed wrote a foreword to it, along with a famous cognitive therapist. So I was very touched by that. And one of the things I got from that experience was I discovered a way to say thank you, which is I took an oral history of Ed Diener, and it led to me trying to seek out all of my mentors and inspirations in my life, of which you, Joe Sirgy, are one of the greatest.
Let's talk about milestones.
Yes.
What kind of milestones do you see in your program of research in your own career? Tell us something about that.
Well, I think we've discussed those very well. I think this idea of the you do for your dissertation and thesis, you may do work in areas of your advisor, but you want to individuate and do your own thing. And this is where I was fortunate enough at Baylor to be supported in finding a whole new area of well-being, and then trying to apply that to the clinical enterprise. I had a wonderful dean that supported my work, and a trip to Oxford that really helped. I had and these wonderful academics, and so I think that really, those are the two biggest milestones. I would say too that I had a situation at Baylor that was very unique, where I could train PsyD students, doctoral students in clinical psychology, an APA-approved program, but I also was expected to do clinical work myself. So I did coaching and clinical work, and it helped me to develop these measures and these techniques, very similar to Ruth Veenhoven at Erasmus University. He was given some leeway to think deep thoughts and, plumb the depths of well-being research, and I had some of that freedom too, and this enabled me to develop the quality of life inventory, quality of life therapy, and coaching, and I think the unfortunate thing is that I see that as a very rare opportunity. So I think more and more academics were expected to fund ourselves with grants in very specific areas of research, and I feel very lucky I had this moment of freedom where I had some extra time to think, and I could actually do clinical work out of my office at Baylor, do coaching work out of my home, and mentor students, but also develop this new approach. The funny thing is, I always promised myself that I wouldn't become an academic because I thought it looked like it was so much work. And then I said I would never develop a psychological test because it's very labor intensive to validate it. Then the idea of developing a therapy approach or positive psychology intervention approach, I always promised myself I'd never do that because it's a lot of work to develop something like that and then test it. I did the first randomized controlled trial at Baylor with depressed people, and using quality of life therapy was very effective. And recently Marty Seligman said that I was the #1 pioneer in positive psychology intervention, along with Giovanni Fava of the University of Bologna. And so that my trial was published in 1995. Marty christened the field in 1998. And of course, as we all know, there's other people that, Ed Diener puts it this way. He said, you studied positive psychology before it was cool. Well, we have people like Ed and others who, Alex Michaelos and the International Society for Quality of Life Researchers, Ken Land, and Joseph Sirgy, who really pioneered things that the rest of us could build on.
Do you use quality of life therapy in your classes? Do you introduce this concept to your students? And how do you do that? In what context?
Well, it's a great question because, if you look at the field, it initially was trivialized by many people. So Ed Diener lost a promotion to full professor for studying happiness. My colleagues have always thought that it was kind of a fluff thing until they began to see the journals fill up with articles, including neuroscience studies. So I have the privilege of teaching one of the few positive psychology it's called positive psychology or well-being, which is a more preferential interdisciplinary term, courses, in the United States. And my students will study the research, know how to write papers and assimilate and critique research, but also then apply this to their own lives. And I've had recently Baylor just built a huge dormitory for pre-health students. They've asked me to help them and teach students how to build a balanced life of meaning, a la Joe Sirgy and Wu. And so I've been very lucky to be able to teach that. I've also taught it in graduate courses, and I've supervised young clinical psychologists in very difficult settings, sex offender settings, criminal justice settings, and had tremendous success with this approach.
Well, That's definitely a handful. You've done so much and you've accomplished so much. How do you want to be remembered?
I think I'd like to be remembered as someone who was a good friend and loving father, and I'm very humbled and thankful for people like you and the people in ISQUALs and in my life, academics and others who've supported my work. So that's how I'd like to be remembered.
That's wonderful. Well, in summing up, do you have any other words of wisdom to impart? Like, for example, what is quality of life to people in general? And ultimately, if there's a couple of words that you want to say about why they should do that.
Well, we can go back to the trinity of happiness benefits, and but I think for me one of the big messages is not to lose hope. So in the Pulitzer Prize winning book Gilead by Marilyn Robinson, and one of my passions is history, current events, music, trying to weave the arts into my teaching. But this Pulitzer Prize winning book, in it there's this older minister in this very poor area of Iowa, John Ames, who says, there are 1,000 ways to find joy in this life. So what I would like to do is encourage people not to lose hope, to try to stay optimistic, and to find things to give their life to, causes near and dear to themselves, outside of themselves, but also related to themselves, and pursue these with vigor, because I think that's where it goes back to Lao Tzu's thing in the Tao Te Ching. He said, spent then renewed. So we're renewed by giving to others and finding something compelling to do with our lives. And I hope that people can keep the faith and stay optimistic, because we have many stories of resilience, another area of positive psychology, where people have overcome difficult odds, found new avenues of happiness. Unfortunately, in the prison of depression and anxiety, we sometimes don't see hope, and yet the hope is there. And we can interview people who've attempted suicide and not succeeded, and they're like, thank God it didn't work out, because now I've cobbled together or sculpt a life of meaning. This relates to a self-help book I wrote that popularizes my work, and it actually summarizes the entire curriculum at the University of Pennsylvania and their Master of Arts in Positive Psychology program. It's a book I wrote with a prominent coach, Caroline Adams Miller, called Creating Your Best Life. And what I would like to see is people have a hope that they can create, maybe not their best life, that may be too grandiose, but a life of some meaning or happiness. And I also want to give credit to other people in the field. Jean Endicott, who worked with Bob Spitzer, who wrote she helped to write the DSM-3, a groundbreaking book for American Psychiatric Association. She had the same idea I had, which is, let's ask our patients if they're basically content with their life. Hans Strupp had the same idea, one of the preeminent clinical researchers from Vanderbilt University. So let's be very practical about quality of life, and ask our patients about this when they see the doctor, ask ourselves about it even when we're healthy, and then plug into the research-based work that can lead to a happier, more fulfilling life.
In summing up, I think I'm going to read a quote that really captures the essence of who Michael Frisch is. And this is a quote from the APA Journal of Book Reviews based on your book. Michael Frisch is a passionate therapist and coach, a fervent educator, and a disciplined researcher. I think really that captures you well, don't you think, Mike?
I think you're very kind, and you're one of my inspirations. So thank you for doing this today.
Thanks, Mike.